It began on a quiet Thursday morning, the kind where the air was cool, the sun rose slow, and the neighborhood still seemed wrapped in sleep. For months, life on Sycamore Lane had been peaceful, or at least as peaceful as a suburban cul-de-sac could be under the watchful eyes of the HOA and the endless personality clashes of its residents. I had moved here to escape city noise, to trade traffic horns for birdsong and the soft padding of my golden retriever, Max, following me from room to room. Max wasn't just a pet. He was a quiet companion, loyal in the way only dogs can be, with a bark reserved for strangers or the occasional squirrel that dared cross our yard. But according to Karen Whitmore, my next-door neighbor and self-appointed guardian of community standards, Max was a menace. The first complaint arrived in my mailbox in a crisp, formal envelope stamped with the HOA logo. The letter claimed multiple residents had complained about excessive barking and threatened fines if the issue wasn't resolved immediately. The words felt almost laughable. Max barely barked enough to wake himself up from a nap, let alone keep anyone awake at night. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was a mistake. But the tone of the letter made something clear. This wasn't a friendly notice. It was a shot fired across my property line. Karen's signature was at the bottom as board member, written in bold, almost aggressive strokes. Over the next week, subtle changes started to ripple through the neighborhood. Neighbors I usually waved to avoided eye contact. Conversations seemed to halt when I stepped outside. A sense of unease crept into my mornings, like I'd been placed under some invisible watch. Then came the second letter, sharper in tone, threatening formal HOA action and larger fines. The letter claimed that multiple witnesses had confirmed the ongoing disturbance. It was obvious who those witnesses were. Karen had a history of rallying a few like-minded residents to her causes, no matter how baseless. Still, I wasn't ready for what came next. That Friday afternoon, I returned from running errands to see a police cruiser parked in front of my house. The officer was already walking toward my front door, a clipboard in hand. Karen stood at the edge of her driveway, arms folded, her expression a smug cocktail of self-satisfaction and fake concern. The officer explained they had received a noise complaint, a 911 call, alleging that my dog had been barking nonstop for hours, causing severe distress to neighbors. I glanced at Max, who was lying in the sun, tail thumping lazily. If this was her game, she was playing it dangerously well. I knew in that moment this wasn't just about noise. This was personal. Karen had chosen me as her next target. That night, I decided to take action. I had recently installed a new set of high-definition security cameras around the property, partly for safety, partly for peace of mind. Now, they would serve a new purpose, gathering proof. If Max wasn't barking, I'd have the footage to show it. And if he was, I'd still know the truth. The cameras recorded in sharp detail, complete with audio. They covered the backyard where Max liked to lounge, the front porch, and the side gate leading toward Karen's property. I adjusted the settings, making sure no moment of the day would go unrecorded. Over the next few days, I let the cameras run. I noted the times Karen usually claimed the barking was at its worst. What I saw instead was Max spending most of the day stretched out in the shade, occasionally getting up for water or to follow me around the garden. There were no long stretches of barking, but then something unexpected appeared in the footage. Around noon on Tuesday, while I was out, Karen could be seen walking along the side of my fence. She paused, leaned over slightly, and made a strange motion, as if tossing something into my yard. Max got up, sniffed the grass, and soon after a distant, muffled bark followed. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was nothing. But when I reviewed the footage again later that night, another strange moment appeared, this time in the front yard. Karen had been standing near my porch steps, peering at my door camera, muttering to herself before quickly walking away. The footage had begun to tell a story I hadn't expected. Karen wasn't just reporting on my dog. She was setting the stage for something bigger. I still didn't know why. But as I watched the last clip of her pacing along the street, phone in hand, looking back at my house like a hawk circling prey, I realized this wasn't going to end with a letter or a police visit. No. Something told me this was just the opening move in a game I hadn't agreed to play. And Karen had no idea that every move she made was now being recorded. Chapter 2, The Pattern Emerges. The footage from those first few days. replayed in my mind like a reel I couldn't turn off. Karen pacing along the fence. Karen tossing something over. Karen lurking near my front porch as if she owned the air in front of my door. It was strange behavior for anyone, but especially for someone who claimed to be so deeply invested in community harmony. I decided to expand my watch. My security system had the ability to store weeks' worth of recordings, so I set it to capture and archive everything. If Karen's goal was to create a case against me, I would quietly build my own, one built on timestamps. Clear audio and indisputable video proof. The first week brought more subtle intrusions. Twice Karen wandered onto the strip of grass between our properties, technically mine, pretending to inspect the shared hedge. Once she crouched low, her back to my house, as though hiding something behind the bushes. Each time Max would lift his head, tail wagging lazily, never barking unless she startled him. But her 911 calls didn't stop. In fact, they became more frequent. Every few days, an officer would knock on my door, clipboard in hand, clearly uncomfortable with being dragged out for something so trivial. The visits followed the same pattern. Karen would be outside somewhere nearby, watching. She never approached during the calls. Only later, when the police had left, walking past with that thin, satisfied smile, like she'd just won a small battle. It wasn't just me who noticed. One afternoon, I caught my neighbor from across the street, Mr. Rojas, watching her through his blinds. When our eyes met, he simply shook his head and stepped back. Even without words, I understood the sentiment. Karen had a history here. I was only the latest chapter in her long-running campaign of control. Then came the footage that made my stomach twist. It was early Saturday morning. I had left the house briefly to run to the hardware store. The cameras caught Karen approaching my backyard gate. She looked around, scanning the street, before slipping a small, handheld device from her jacket pocket. I couldn't tell what it was at first. She pressed a button, and from inside my yard, Max began to bark, loud, sharp, confused. She pressed it again. More barking. I'd read about such devices before. Ultrasonic sound emitters, designed to trigger or deter barking. In the wrong hands, they could be used as harassment tools. If she was using one, she wasn't just making Max bark. She was manufacturing evidence to feed her complaints. The footage didn't lie. It showed Max settling back down moments after she left, his tail tucked and ears drooping. It was one thing to complain about noise. It was another to actively cause it, then call the police as if she were an innocent victim. But this still didn't answer the question burning in the back of my mind. Why? Why target me so relentlessly? Over the next few days, I kept watching, cataloging, labeling every clip. I marked the times of each 911 call and matched them with the footage. In every case, Karen's appearance on my property, or suspiciously close to it, occurred within minutes before the alleged barking fits began. The pattern was airtight. Then, on Wednesday afternoon, the cameras caught something even stranger. Karen wasn't alone this time. A man, older, dressed in a worn ball cap, joined her near the side of my fence. They spoke briefly, glancing toward my backyard. He handed her something small before walking away. Karen tucked it into her jacket and disappeared around the corner. The footage stirred a new unease in me. It wasn't just her anymore. Someone else was involved. I didn't yet know who he was or why he was part of this, but the connection felt deliberate. Karen's war against me was bigger than a barking dog. That night I sat in my living room, the quiet hum of the security system a strange comfort. Outside, the street lay still, the houses lit, in warm tones. Somewhere in the darkness, Karen was probably watching, plotting her next move. She thought she was in control of the narrative, the complaining neighbor protecting the peace of the community. But she didn't realize the story had shifted. She was no longer the storyteller. I was. And every chapter from here on would be written with her secrets in mind. Chapter 3. The setup unravels. The morning after spotting the unknown man with Karen, I began combing through every angle of my security recordings, hoping to catch a clearer glimpse of his face. The footage from the front yard offered the best view, a fleeting profile, weathered skin, and the brim of his cap shadowing his eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough to show he wasn't a casual passerby. His body language with Karen was familiar, comfortable, the kind that comes from more than a quick introduction. The timing of his appearance was telling. The barking complaints had escalated in the last 2 weeks, aligning perfectly with his visits. If Karen had started this campaign alone, perhaps she had now recruited him for something larger. That morning was unusually quiet. Max lounged near the sliding glass door, the winter light casting long shadows across the kitchen floor. I watched him for a long moment, appreciating the stillness, before glancing toward the monitor displaying my live security feeds. At first, the street outside seemed empty, but just before noon, movement caught my eye. Karen's familiar silhouette appeared at the edge of the frame, followed by the same man from the footage. They weren't in their usual spots by the side gate or near the hedge. Instead, they were closer to the front yard, lingering near my driveway, whispering in low tones. The man bent down briefly, his hands moving near the base of my mailbox. Karen kept watch, scanning the street. It lasted less than 30 seconds before they walked off in opposite directions, each pretending to be busy with something else. I knew better than to check immediately. If I stepped outside the moment they left, they'd know I was watching. So I waited, forcing myself to focus on anything else. The faint ticking of the wall clock, the slow swirl of coffee in my mug. An hour later, I made my way casually to the mailbox. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. But tucked at the very back, nearly hidden, was a small folded piece of paper. There was no envelope, no stamp, no HOA letterhead, just a hastily scrawled note. It read, "Noise violation hearing, HOA board meeting, mandatory attendance. Failure to appear will result in immediate penalties." There was no date, no time, no official signature. It reeked of fabrication, the kind of thing someone would plant to create panic, to pressure a reaction. The irony wasn't lost on me. Karen's entire crusade was built on pretending to follow the rules while bending them beyond recognition. This note was proof she wasn't just bending them, she was manufacturing them from thin air. I kept the paper, photographing it alongside the footage of the man placing it. The puzzle was starting to take shape. Karen wasn't simply trying to get me fined. She was building a false record of non-compliance, perhaps to push for more drastic action, a lien, or even an attempt to force me to sell. That evening, I revisited the recordings from the past month in chronological order. The pattern emerged with unnerving clarity. Karen loitering or tampering near my property, a suspicious noise or incident triggering Max's barking, a 911 call within minutes, with Karen visibly present in the vicinity, follow-up action in the form of false notices or fabricated HOA demands. It wasn't incompetence. It was choreography. But then came the discovery that shifted everything. While scrolling through footage from a week prior, I caught something I'd missed before. Karen, late at night, in the alley behind her house. She wasn't alone. The man was there again, and between them was a large, heavy-looking trash bag. They struggled to lift it into the trunk of an old sedan. The bag was too big to be typical household trash. The camera's microphone picked up a faint clinking sound, like glass or metal inside. It wasn't directly related to the barking accusations, but it was odd, suspicious, and in a neighborhood where Karen was supposed to be the enforcer of order. The sight of her sneaking around with a partner and a bag of unknown contents painted a very different picture. By now, the cameras had become more than just a defensive measure. They were a window into the side of the neighborhood most people never saw, and a spotlight on the hypocrisy Karen tried so hard to keep hidden. As I archived the new clips and filed the fabricated notice into a growing folder, marked evidence, I realized the tide was turning. Karen might have started this fight, but I was the one with the truth on my side. And the truth, when exposed at the right time, had the power to unravel everything she'd built. Chapter 4, The First Crack. The more I pieced together the footage, the more it became clear Karen wasn't just playing the role of an overzealous neighbor. She was running a campaign of manipulation, using Max's barking as her cover story, while something else simmered beneath the surface. I'd seen her toss things into my yard, trigger Max into barking with that handheld device, plant false notices in my mailbox, and meet with the unknown man under the cover of night. Every clip told the same story, a woman obsessed with control, willing to falsify, fabricate, and even trespass to get her way. But it was the trash bag footage that stuck in my mind. It had weight, both literal and figurative. There was no logical explanation for why a self-proclaimed rule enforcer would risk being seen, sneaking a heavy, clinking bag into a stranger's car trunk. It didn't match the pristine, by-the-book persona she showed at HOA meetings. The opportunity to probe further came sooner than expected. It was a Sunday morning when the HOA email blast went out. Monthly board meeting. All residents welcome. The meetings were usually tedious affairs, filled with debates over lawn heights and holiday decorations, but this one had a sharper tone. The agenda included discussion of noise complaints. A direct reference to me and Max. I decided to attend, not to defend myself outright, but to watch. Karen thrived when her narrative went unchallenged, and I wanted to see how she handled being observed up close. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a space that smelled faintly of coffee and cleaning supplies. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows, and a long table at the front held the board members. Karen sat in the middle, posture rigid, wearing her usual, sharp-pressed blouse and that faint smile that looked friendly to the untrained. I but read as condescending to anyone who'd crossed her. As the meeting rolled on, I let her talk. She brought up the ongoing noise disturbance from my property, citing multiple eyewitnesses and claiming the problem persisted. Despite repeated warnings, she had no actual evidence, only the weight of her voice and her reputation, among those who hadn't yet learned her patterns. But when she moved on to the next item, something subtle happened. A man in the back, quiet, arms crossed, shifted in his seat. It was him. The same man from the footage. He kept his head low, avoiding my eyes, but there was no mistaking the ball cap and weathered face. He wasn't a resident. I'd checked the HOA directory, yet here he was, sitting in on a meeting he had no business attending. Karen never acknowledged him, but every so often, her gaze flicked in his direction, quick and deliberate. After the meeting, I lingered near the entrance, pretending to check my phone. Karen exited first, engaging another resident in a performative, loud conversation about neighborhood peace. The man slipped out moments later, heading toward the far end of the parking lot where the same old sedan from the trash bag footage was parked. I waited until they were both gone before heading back home to review my cameras. The meeting itself hadn't revealed much, but the dynamic between Karen and the man was undeniable. He wasn't a bystander. He was a partner, maybe even the one helping her with whatever was inside that heavy bag. Later that week, the first crack appeared. It started with a simple, unexpected knock on my door. It was Mr. Rojas from across the street. He wasn't one for small talk, so when he stepped inside and closed the door behind him, I knew it was important. Without preamble, he told me he'd seen Karen and the same man moving something late at night on multiple occasions, not just the one I'd caught on camera. Large bags, boxes, and even small furniture all loaded into that same sedan. He didn't know what it meant, but it didn't look right. I showed him a few clips from my recordings. The bag, the device, the mailbox stunt. He watched silently, jaw tightening with each passing second. When the video ended, he exhaled slowly and said, "She's going to hang herself with this." It was the first time I felt the balance shift. Until now, Karen's power came from the assumption that no one would challenge her, that her word was law. But now, someone else had seen what I'd seen. I wasn't just a lone target pushing back. I had a witness. And in neighborhoods like this, once one person sees through the illusion, others soon follow. What I didn't know then was that Karen's secret wasn't just something she kept from me. It was something she kept from the entire neighborhood. And once the edges began to fray, the unraveling would be impossible to stop. Chapter 5, The Evidence Turns. By the time the week closed in, my evidence folder had grown into something substantial. Dozens of labeled video clips, photographs of the planted notice, audio files of the ultrasonic device in use, and now Mr. Rojas's verbal account corroborating my observations. It was no longer just a defense against a false barking complaint. It was a case file, one that could stand on its own if the right audience saw it. Karen, of course, carried on as if nothing had changed. She walked the neighborhood with her clipboard, inspecting hedges, measuring lawns, smiling tightly at passers-by. She even had the audacity to wave at me from her driveway one morning, as though this was a friendly feud between neighbors rather than an orchestrated smear campaign. But behind her composure, the cracks were spreading. On Tuesday afternoon, another 911 Call came in, another claim that Max was barking incessantly. This time I had been home all day. Max had slept for hours in the living room. The steady rise and fall of his breathing almost hypnotic. The call was a lie from start to finish. When the responding officer arrived, clipboard ready, I invited him inside. I didn't speak much. I didn't need to. Instead, I played back the footage from that exact time frame. There was Max dozing in the sun, the room silent except for the occasional creak of the house. There was Karen walking past my gate at 11:42 a.m., pausing just long enough to aim the device into the yard before moving on. Seconds later, Max barked, startled and confused, then went quiet again. The officer watched the clip without comment, but his posture shifted. When the video ended, he cleared his throat and said only that he would make a note in the file. It was a small phrase, but I recognized its weight, a signal that her credibility was beginning to erode where it mattered most. Still, the barking accusations were only half the battle. My instincts told me that exposing her real secret would end the game completely, and that meant returning to the most puzzling piece of footage, the late-night bag. I began scanning through nighttime recordings, not just on my property, but from the street-facing camera that sometimes caught a glimpse of the alley behind Karen's house. Patterns emerged quickly. The man's sedan appeared twice a week. Always after 10 p.m., he never parked in her driveway, always just out of sight, as if avoiding curious eyes. Each time, he and Karen loaded heavy bags or boxes into the trunk. One clip from 3 weeks ago stood out. Karen had parked her own SUV down the street, far from her driveway. The man arrived, and they worked quickly to transfer several unmarked cardboard boxes from her garage to his trunk. One box tipped slightly in her hands, and the camera microphone caught the faint but unmistakable clink of glass, identical to the sound from the trash bag footage. It was clear they weren't just moving household clutter. Whatever they were transporting, they were going to lengths to avoid detection. My next move was deliberate. I compiled a short highlight reel from the security footage. No commentary. No speculation, just timestamps, clear visuals, and the raw audio. It included Karen using the ultrasonic device on Max, Max lying quietly during the time of alleged non-stop barking, the man placing the fake HOA notice in my mailbox, Karen and the man transferring heavy bags and boxes late at night. I kept the tone matter of fact. No accusations, no labels, just the truth laid bare. Then I sent a copy to the HOA board, every member except Karen. I didn't expect a swift reaction, but the silence in the following days spoke louder than any immediate reply. The next time I saw two of the board members speaking with her in her driveway, they weren't smiling. The neighborhood's subtle shift was palpable. Conversations that once stopped when I walked by, now paused when she appeared. Mr. Rojas told me he'd overheard a couple on the next street questioning why. Karen had been meeting with some stranger so late at night. Karen could feel the air changing. She became sharper in her movements, more guarded. She stopped lingering near my fence. The man's visits grew less frequent, and when he did appear, they kept their exchanges short. But secrets like hers don't shrink under pressure. They swell, pushing against the edges of the facade until something bursts. And I knew the moment was coming. The next Friday night, my cameras caught something entirely different. Not Karen in the shadows, but the man alone. He parked further down the block, walked briskly to her side gate, and let himself in with a key. When he left 20 minutes later, he wasn't carrying anything heavy, just a small, flat envelope tucked under his arm. I didn't know what was inside, but I knew it mattered. And I knew that if Karen's hold on the neighborhood was slipping, the contents of that envelope might be the final push that would bring it all crashing down. Chapter 6. The badge comes out. The sight of the man leaving Karen's property with that flat envelope kept replaying in my head. It was different from the usual pattern. No heavy bags, no clinking boxes, no hurried loading into the trunk. Whatever was inside, it wasn't part of their usual late-night transfers. It was something smaller, something that could disappear easily if you didn't know to look for it. The man drove off quickly, headlights off until he reached the end of the block. I marked the footage and filed it in my ever-growing evidence folder. This was no longer just a matter of HOA politics or petty harassment. Karen's game had edges that extended well beyond neighborhood disputes. 2 days later, the unexpected happened. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when a black unmarked SUV pulled into the neighborhood, parking discreetly at the curb. A man in plain clothes stepped out, his expression neutral but his posture purposeful. I didn't recognize him, but the way he scanned the street before walking toward. My house told me he wasn't here to sell solar panels or magazine subscriptions. When I answered the door, he introduced himself as Detective Warren from the county sheriff's office. His badge flashed briefly before disappearing into his jacket. He explained that he was following up on a matter involving multiple suspicious activities reported in the area, and that my name had come up as someone who might have useful information. I didn't speak much. Instead, I led him into the living room and brought up the archive on my computer. The clips spoke for themselves: Karen's trespassing, the ultrasonic device, the fake notice, the late-night bag transfers, and now the mysterious envelope. I kept my voice measured, pointing out timestamps and dates, never offering speculation, only facts. By the time the reel ended, Detective Warren's neutral expression had shifted slightly, not surprise, but confirmation, as though the pieces fit a puzzle he'd been assembling for weeks. He didn't reveal much, only that the man in my footage was already known to their department and that his connection to Karen was of significant interest. When I asked about the envelope, he simply said, "We'll be looking into it." The detective left as quietly as he'd arrived, but the presence of law enforcement was like a silent thunderclap in the neighborhood. People noticed the SUV, they noticed the badge, and they noticed that it had stopped in front of my house, not Karen's. By the next morning, the undercurrent had shifted entirely. Whispers spread along Sycamore Lane. Karen emerged less frequently from her house, and when she did, she walked quickly, eyes scanning the street. The man's sedan didn't appear for several days. Then came the break I hadn't anticipated. One of the HOA board members, a woman named Linda, stopped by under the pretense of delivering the latest newsletter. Her visit was brief, but as she handed me the folded paper, she lowered her voice and said, "Whatever you've shown the police, keep going. Some of us have been waiting for this." It wasn't an admission, but it was close. It told me that my quiet documentation had stirred something in the board, that Karen's control wasn't as complete as she'd believed. 2 days later, the man's sedan returned. This time, he didn't use the alley or the side gate. He pulled directly into Karen's driveway in broad daylight, staying only long enough to hand her another envelope. She glanced at it, her face tightening, then quickly ushered him inside. When they re-emerged 20 minutes later, Karen was carrying a large plastic bin toward the trunk of his car. She moved faster than I'd ever seen her move, her eyes darting toward the street every few seconds. The bin looked heavy, and when it shifted in her grip, I caught a faint metallic clang. The moment they drove away, my phone buzzed. It was an email from Detective Warren. Short, direct. "Your footage is proving useful. Keep your cameras rolling." I didn't know exactly what they were building toward, but I knew this much. Karen's secret wasn't just a matter of neighborhood drama anymore. It was under investigation, and when law enforcement took an interest, it was only a matter of time before whatever she'd been hiding spilled into the open. What I didn't yet realize was that when it finally happened, it wouldn't just clear my name, it would tear through the perfect image she'd spent years cultivating, and the neighborhood would never see her the same way again. Chapter 7. The Neighborhood Trial. By the time the unofficial neighborhood trial was scheduled, tension in the cul-de-sac had reached its peak. No one was quite sure who had organized it. Rumor had it that Paul from 2 streets over, the self-proclaimed mediator of all community disputes, had taken it upon himself to arrange a gathering. Whether people came for justice, gossip, or pure entertainment was another matter entirely. Chairs were set up in a semicircle in Paul's expansive driveway, creating a makeshift courtroom under the dim glow of string lights and a glaring portable flood lamp. A long folding table stood at the front, cluttered with printed evidence, a laptop, and an old gavel someone had dug out from a Halloween costume bin. The air was thick with anticipation, and though no one openly admitted it, this gathering had the feel of an event no one wanted to miss. Karen arrived early, wearing a smug smile and carrying a manila folder, like it contained the very essence of truth. She moved with a confidence that was almost theatrical, taking her seat front and center. Her supporters, or at least those who pretended, to be clustered near her, exchanging quiet remarks. Across from them, I arrived with a calm, deliberate pace, the flash drive in my pocket holding, the very footage that could end her. Narrative once and for all. The first half hour was nothing, more than a murmur of speculation and scattered accusations. Paul, trying his best to play judge, called for order in a voice that carried no real authority, but enough novelty to silence the crowd. Karen spoke first, painting a vivid picture of her life. Under siege from my supposedly relentless dog, she described sleepless nights, trembling hands, and days ruined by the constant barrage of barking. It was the same script she had been performing for weeks, but tonight, there was an edge, she believed. This was her stage to cement the neighborhood's opinion once and for all. When my turn came, I didn't start with defense. I started with the truth. I plugged in the flash drive, and the laptop screen flickered to life. The footage played, quiet mornings, my dog lying in the sun, the occasional bark at a passing squirrel, nothing more. The room shifted. The narrative she had built began to erode in real time, but I didn't stop there. The next clip changed everything. Karen, in the middle of the night, crouching near my fence, holding something in her hand. A squeaky toy. She squeezed it rhythmically, looking toward my yard, trying to provoke my dog into barking. The sound was faint on the recording, but it was enough to match the timestamps of her own complaints. She had been baiting my dog for weeks. Gasps rippled through the semicircle. Even those who had stood beside her now looked away, embarrassed. Karen's smile froze, then faltered entirely. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. Paul cleared his throat, attempting to keep things civil, but the room had already shifted beyond civility. The footage rolled on, showing her tossing scraps of food toward my dog's side of the fence, pacing in front of my yard with exaggerated gestures, and even whispering something. Though the camera had no audio that night, the intent was unmistakable. She wasn't a victim of noise disturbance. She was the cause. By the time the clip ended, silence had settled like a heavy blanket. The trial was over in all but name. Karen's folder of papers sat untouched on the table. Her once proud stance reduced to stillness. People began murmuring, not about my dog, but about her. The tide had turned completely, and the very public stage she'd chosen for her story had become the place where her credibility collapsed. The flood lamp hummed quietly, the only sound breaking the pause. I stood, thanked the group for their time, and walked away without looking back. The crowd didn't call after me. They didn't need to. The message had been delivered. But as I reached my driveway, a thought struck me. This wasn't over, not for Karen. People like her didn't fade quietly into the background. If anything, this public humiliation would ignite something worse. And I was right. The next morning, my mailbox was gone. Chapter 8. The Final Bark. The neighborhood never looked the same after that day. For months, whispers still lingered on driveways and over backyard fences. But the air had shifted. Karen, once the self-proclaimed protector of the block, now walked in the shadows of her own making. Her manicured hedges no longer screamed superiority, and the once immaculate front porch sat bare. No wreaths, no seasonal decor, just a silent front that seemed to reflect her absence from the community's heart. After the footage aired and the legal dust settled, she tried to carry on as if nothing had happened. But eyes followed her everywhere. Parents pulled their children a little closer, not in fear, but in disapproval. Invitations to HOA meetings stopped arriving. Even the HOA president, who once stood shoulder to shoulder with her, suddenly had other things to focus on whenever she approached. She had been dethroned. Without a single vote, stripped of her, self-assigned crown by the weight of truth. For me, life found a rhythm again. My dog, Max, roamed the yard freely, chasing squirrels and sunbeams without the looming threat of police sirens. The neighbors who once avoided me now waved when they passed by, some even stopping to apologize for believing her stories. A few even admitted they'd been relieved someone finally stood up to her, someone who didn't just back down when she swung her accusations like weapons. The most unexpected change came from the HOA itself. The board quietly introduced new rules, ones that required any complaints to be backed by verifiable evidence before action could be taken. No more weaponizing rules, no more personal vendettas under the guise of community standards. The move was a silent acknowledgement that they'd allowed Karen too much unchecked influence for too long. Karen's secret, as the neighborhood now referred to it, became part of the block's folklore. Children whispered it like a ghost story during summer campfires, and adults traded the tale in hushed tones when new families moved in. She was no longer the feared enforcer, she was the cautionary tale. In the quiet moments, I often thought about how it all began. Just a false report about a barking dog. A petty grievance. A small lie. But lies have a way of unraveling, especially when they're spun by someone who thinks they're untouchable. In her eagerness to control the block, she exposed more than my innocence. She exposed herself. Months later, I caught sight of her on an overcast morning. She was pulling weeds from her lawn, hair tied back, wearing a faded sweatshirt instead of her usual designer cardigans. For a brief moment, she glanced my way. Our eyes met, and there was no anger left in hers, just resignation. She quickly looked away, her hands returning to the soil. Max barked once from the porch, not at her, but at a passing squirrel. I couldn't help but smile. That bark, the very sound she once used as a weapon against me, now carried no weight. It was just a dog being a dog, a reminder of how small the spark was that lit the fire. The street was peaceful again. No threats, no false reports, no midnight visits from police officers, knocking on my door because someone claimed the barking never stops. The balance had returned, and Karen's reign was nothing more than a story we'd tell on quiet nights. In the end, it wasn't revenge that won, it was truth. And the truth has a way of barking louder than any lie, no matter how convincing it sounds at first. And so, Max lay down on the porch in the afternoon sun. The neighborhood hushed except for the distant hum of lawnmowers and the soft chirping of birds. The war was over. Karen was still there, but she was no longer the storm. She had become part of the scenery, quiet, unnoticed, irrelevant. And that, I realized, was the greatest victory of all. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe.